navigating the pain and problems from your parents' divorce. Today, on The Simple Truth, we consecrate everything to the Sacred Heart of Jesus through the Immaculate Heart of Mary and the pure, strong, chaste heart of Saint Joseph. I'm your host, Jim Havens, and our guest today is Joey Pontarelli, Catholic husband and father, founder and president of Restored. Restored gives practical advice and tools to help teens and young adults cope, heal, and grow from the trauma of their parents' divorce or separation, and so they can feel whole again and thrive in every area of life. You can check it out, restoredministry.com. Joey is also the author of It's Not Your Fault, a practical guide to navigating the pain and problems from your parents' divorce. Joey Pontarelli, welcome back to The Simple Truth. How are you today?
Jim, always good to be with you, man. I'm doing well.
Awesome. Great blessing to have you back with us, and very excited to dive in and get into this and open up the phone lines as well. If anybody else wants to be a part of this show today, we'd love to have your comments and questions, whatever you've got. But first, before we begin, want to remind everyone that iCatholic Mobile is the only Catholic mobile phone company in the U.S. today. So when you subscribe to iCatholic Mobile, you do help fund the Station of the Cross. Check out iCatholic Mobile, iCatholicMobile.com. All right. As we begin, I do want to make mention Joey was on a couple weeks ago, if you missed him, on a Testimony Tuesday, sharing a bit of his personal testimony, which was fantastic. Highly recommend you go back and find that if you missed it. But for those that did miss it and are listening or watching right now, Joey, can you give a little background on your personal experience of your parents' divorce? How has it impacted your life, and anything in terms of, just being able to relate to folks that might be out there listening today?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. When I was about 11 years old, my parents separated and later got divorced, and it absolutely shattered my world. It brought a ton of pain and problems into my life. I struggled with emotional problems like anxiety, depression, loneliness, a lot of anger for me as a boy. I struggled with, in relationships. I was super afraid of love and marriage. I remember swearing I will never get married, because if this is where marriage leads, like, why in the world do I want to put myself through that? And years later, when I started dating and discerning my vocation, there's just so much fear and anxiety related to love, relationships, marriage. I really felt lost and incompetent at it. So that was a big area of struggle for me, which the research says is a very common thing for children of divorce. And finally, I found a lot of bad habits. In an effort to cope with all the pain that I was experiencing, I turned to pornography and other sexual sins. That was kind of my main way of numbing my pain, of drugging myself. And that just, as you can imagine, only led to more and more emptiness. I was miserable. I heard Jason Everett speak, who I know both of us admire. I heard the message of chastity. He answered all the questions I didn't even realize I had about love, relationships, and sexuality. Just super helpful. Took his advice, got poured out of my life, started living a pure life. It really helped. I also got new friends. The sports buddies I was hanging around with weren't good for me. I was essentially becoming like them, and becoming more like them made me more and more miserable. And even as a boy, Jim, I knew I wanted to be happy. And so these new friends were really joyful people. I didn't really understand why, but eventually I learned that they were these devout Catholics who would pray. They'd, practice virtue and, knew their faith really well. And so I started to do all of those things and just seek out God's plan for my life. And all that really helped a ton. Huge for me, but I still felt broken. And so in an attempt to find some help, the questions on my mind was like, how do I heal? Because I saw a direct line between my struggles and the pain that I was wrestling with, directly tied to my parents' separation, later divorce. And so I wanted to know how to heal. And I was really shocked when I looked around that there was nothing simple. There was nothing specific. There was nothing, practical for a young person like me. And over the years, I just noticed how my siblings were struggling, often in serious ways. I noticed how close friends of mine were struggling because of their parents' divorce, often in really serious ways. And so over the years, after spending time in the business world, I just became really passionate about solving this problem. And so, like you said at the top of the show, I started Restored, a new nonprofit that helps teenagers and young adults who come from divorced or dysfunctional families. We help them to heal and build virtue so they don't end up repeating that cycle in their own life. And that's one of the scary things for people like us, is we're afraid of repeating what we saw in our parents' marriage. Studies say that you're 2 to 3 times more likely to get divorced if you come from a divorced family, and none of us want that. And so the question is, like, how do we avoid it? And that's exactly where we step in, where we're trying to help them. And so I found so much help and healing over the years through God's grace, through my Catholic faith, through great mentors, therapy. The list is pretty long. And today, I no longer struggle with bigger constant emotional problems. Like I said, I was able to get porn out of my life. I'm now married. I've been married for over 7 years. We have 4 kids, 1 in heaven, 2 on earth, and 1 on the way. And yeah, my life has certainly drastically transformed. And so that's really our message. It's one of hope that even if you feel broken, even if you're struggling with this sin or this bad habit, or you feel like a good marriage isn't possible for you, we're here to say that with the right help, with healing the trauma, with building virtue, with becoming a saint, essentially becoming holy, you can go on and build those healthy relationships, a strong marriage, and a holy family, if that's what God's calling you to.
Joey Pontarelli is with us, restoredministry.com. And yeah, I certainly relate to Joey and to his story and to his good work. My parents separated, divorced when I was in my high school years. And yeah, it's something that is not talked about anywhere near enough. And if I would have had the resources that Joey is putting out there at restoredministry.com, along with his book, It's Not Your Fault, back then, it would have been extremely helpful to have someone kind of speak into these questions that I at the time didn't even know really what to ask or what was going on or how to make sense of anything. And so just incredibly important work that Joey is doing here. So grateful for it and still learning from it. Still have a lot to learn and really appreciate his work, even at my age now, getting into my late 40s here. But yeah, but really, really wonderful stuff. And so Joey, can you? Well, actually, let me put the phone number out there first. If anybody does want to give a call, get on the line today, we'd love to hear from you. Anything on this topic? Did your parents' divorce affect your faith, your marriage, your view of family? Any way that it impacted you that you'd like to speak to and bring to the light here for the benefit of all? Any questions you might have? Feel free to call in and share any comments, questions. 1-877-511-5483. That's 1-877-511-5483. Joe, I want to ask you, it seems it would be a clear temptation for many parents who do divorce that they want to downplay the effect of divorce on children. Quite naturally, they don't want to feel so bad about it. But what is the truth of it? What is the reality of it? What do we know about the effects of divorce on children? What does the research say about how divorce affects children, short-term, long-term, whatever you want to share with us?
Yeah, there's fascinating research out there, and it's actually a future book that we're going to put on. We're going to summarize over 100 studies. These are from peer-reviewed journals on the topic of divorce, on how divorce affects the children. So that will be at some point in the future. We'll publish that book. We've completed the research on it, and so there's a lot of research out there. I'd point people in 2 places if they want to go deeper into this. One is Dr. Judith Wallerstein at UC Berkeley actually studied children of divorce for 25 years, and she found that she studied 131 children from 60 families. She only had children in the study who didn't have any developmental or emotional problems prior to the divorce. And then she observed the impact that the divorce would have on them and compared them to their peers who came from intact families. And, after studying this for 25 years, she was shocked at the findings. She basically said, I'll have to remember the quote, she said, our findings challenge the myth that divorce is this transient crisis and that as soon as parents reestablish their lives, the children will recover fully. She said that doesn't happen. By the way, when she went into this research, she expected to find that the divorce didn't really affect them. And if it did affect them, the effects would be small and they would be temporary. They wouldn't last very long. But after studying this for years and years and years, she found things like children of divorce, they're more likely to have social problems, behavioral problems. They're more likely to struggle in their relationship with their parents and romantic relationships. They're less likely to get married. They're more likely to get divorced. They're less likely to have children. They're at higher risk for suicide attempts. They have more health problems, like we're talking physical health problems, more emotional problems, and lower self-esteem. I was actually just reading a French study on this topic that looked at 3,000 children and compared them to children from intact families, and they found a significant difference between the kids from intact families and the children of divorce when they look at their self-esteem levels. The children of divorce had lower self-esteem levels. That's just those are a few of the findings. But Wallerstein's research at UC Berkeley, she summarized it in a great book called The Unexpected Legacy of Divorce. The Unexpected Legacy of Divorce, if anyone wants to grab it. Highly recommend it, especially any parents who are listening right now who maybe are in a really tough situation in a marriage where you're considering a divorce. You deserve to have all the information. You could have the truth at your fingertips when you're making that really difficult decision. I don't know all the specifics of your situation. We can certainly share, if we want to get into it, Jim, what the church teaches about this. But from even a secular point of view, just look at the data, just see what that has to say. So that's one researcher. The other one is Paul Amato, Dr. Paul Amato. He's a sociologist at Penn State to this day, and he's been studying children of divorce for over 30 years. And, his findings mimic what I just shared. And so those are a few sources I would recommend. But one of the final things I'll say from Wallerstein's study at UC Berkeley, she said the full effects from your parents' divorce actually aren't experienced typically until adulthood, around college age or beyond. They call it the sleeper effect. It doesn't mean you're not affected beforehand. It's just that the most serious, the most severe, the most impactful effects typically come out after that age. And she said the biggest area of your life, the second takeaway, where you're impacted is your own relationships, especially your future marriage. And we can maybe get into more of why that is. But it's really fascinating. And so there's been a lot of secular science looking into this topic, but for some reason, not a lot of practical resources that have been built to help this audience.
Yeah, thanks be to God for Joey Pontarelli, his good work at restoredministry.com. If you have a story you want to share today, an impact from your parents' divorce that you'd like to speak to or share some experience on, any questions on this topic, 1-877-511-5483, 1-877-511-5483. His book, It's Not Your Fault, it's been described as a practical guide to successfully navigating the 33 most pressing challenges faced by teens and young adults from broken homes. We're going to get into some of those questions when we get back. Stay tuned.
iCatholic Mobile is a 5G wireless provider dedicated to supporting your faith and values, offering unlimited talk and text, reliable data, and plans that support Catholic causes. A portion of every dollar helps sustain the mission of the Station of the Cross Catholic Media Network. With nationwide coverage, iCatholic Mobile connects you to what matters most. More information is available at iCatholicMobile.com.
iCatholic Mobile underwrites for the Station of the Cross.
Welcome back to The Simple Truth. Jim Havens here with Joey Pontarelli. Our guest today is the founder and president of restoredministry.com, which gives practical advice and tools to help teens and young adults cope, heal, and grow from the trauma of their parents' divorce or separation so they can feel whole again and thrive in every area of life. He's also the author of It's Not Your Fault, a practical guide to navigating the pain and problems of your parents' divorce. You can get this wherever you find books. Certainly you can go to the website restoredministry.com and it'll lead you to where you can purchase the book as well. But yeah, early on in the book, you do break open a bit on the church's teaching on this topic. What would you like to share with us about that today?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a big topic, so we'll kind of give the broad strokes, but I definitely encourage everyone to jump into the catechism, perhaps even canon law, give some specific quotes or specific sections if anyone wants to go into that deeper. But at the high level, the church basically says there's two main reasons for a divorce. One, a divorce can be used as a legal maneuver for the protection of the spouse and the children, and for certain legal matters, which we can get into. So you might imagine a situation where there's a family, maybe there's 5 kids, let's say. Mom's at home with the kids. Dad, is having an affair. He runs off with another woman. Mom wants to make the marriage work. Obviously, there's a lot to work through. It's super painful to, have your spouse cheat on you. Like, can you imagine? And so, she's going through a lot, but being a stay-at-home mom, let's say dad was the main breadwinner, she might need to resort to a divorce in order to be able to provide for her children. So in that situation, mom has every intention of, staying true to her wedding vows. She has every intention of, hopefully maybe one day bringing the marriage back together, healing it, even though, again, it would take a lot of work, a lot of help. But in that case, the church says that a divorce is permitted. Some people even prefer going down the route of a legal separation, not a divorce, that there's a little less finality to it. So that's one kind of reason for a divorce, that the church says it can be permitted. Always, with the help of a priest, get a competent, good priest who can help you discern that, navigate through that. The other reason, which the Catechism has really strong language, Jim, around this, even I think a lot of Catholics, we try to soften this a bit, but if you look at what the Catechism says, it's pretty rough. I'm looking here at it, and it says, divorce is a grave offense against natural law. It claims to break the contract to which the spouses freely consented to live with each other till death. Divorce does injury to the covenant of salvation, of which sacramental marriage is the sign. A little bit later, it says divorce is also immoral because it introduces disorder into the family and into society. This disorder brings grave harm to the deserted spouse, like in the example, to children traumatized by the separation of their parents and often torn between them. I can relate to that. And because its contagious effect, which makes it truly a plague on society. Pretty strong language. That's, by the way, 2384 and 2385 in the Catechism of the Catholic Church. So that lays out the Church's teaching. So essentially the Church is saying, if you leave your marriage because you're unhappy, because you want to just run off with someone else, any other list of reasons, that's wrong. That's a sin. That is something that you need to stay true to your wedding vows. You need to work through the problems that you're facing. Now, the reason I gave before maybe was a simplified example. People listening right now might be thinking, well, what about abuse? What about a situation where there's, physical abuse or sexual abuse or, even just like very severe, prolonged, emotional abuse, though that's more difficult to define. Like, what about those situations? And in those situation, what the Church basically says is that, yes, there might be a need for the spouses to step away for a time, to get a breather, to seek help. But the goal would always be to bring the family back together, assuming it's safe. The Church is never saying continue living in an unsafe situation. Of course not. If a spouse is in danger, if children are in danger of violence, of being, hit, of death, maybe even, you need to get to safety. Of course, no brainer. What the Church is saying is that for especially those more minor things, we need to work through it. We need to build up marriages. We need to have this understanding that there are seasons within marriage that are difficult, that are hard. And we need to, instead of giving people the option to, if you're not happy anymore, you can just go get divorced. We need to encourage them to stay true to it. And we can go into this a little bit deeper if you want to, but the secular research on this topic found that about 30% of divorces, a little less than 30% of divorces, are high conflict divorces. Those cases where there's, violence, where there's maybe the threat of death, where there's just a lot of visible dysfunction, things that it's a clear situation where there needs to be a lot of healing and perhaps even a separation for the safety of the spouse and the children. That's about 30% of cases, according to Dr. Paul Amato and some other researchers that I mentioned earlier. Over 70% of divorces are low conflict, where especially to the children, things seem fine. And there might be truly problems within the marriage that need to be worked through, and maybe even problems that have attempted to be worked through, but there's still that, wall that they're hitting. But over 70% of marriages of divorces are low conflict. And those are actually the most traumatizing to the children, according to Amato's research, because to the children, things might seem maybe unhappy, but they're stable. And then one day their whole world is torn apart. Dad leaves, mom leaves, they're no longer living in one home. Now they're living in two homes. They have maybe two schools. They have two sets of friends. There's just so much pain, so many problems that enter into their lives. And so that's kind of a high level view of what the Church teaches and some of the secular research that maybe ties into it. But I again recommend everyone look at the Catechism. 2383 is where it starts. It goes through 2386. And then if you want to check out the canon law, actually, the Code of Canon Law, you can look at 1151 and 1155. 1151, 1155, and I didn't get into that part yet, but we could talk about that as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great stuff. And yeah, just to be clear as well about what we're talking about when we say divorce, we are talking about civil divorce, right? We're not talking about divorce in terms of one's valid Christian marriage. There is no such thing as divorce there. It's an indissoluble thing that has been done, right? These vows have been made validly, and a marriage exists till death do they part. That's for real. So there is no Catholic divorce. People want to play games and pretend, oh, you Catholics have divorce. You just call it annulments. Well, let's be clear here. While there may be vast abuse of annulments in our day, that's a slightly different topic, but just to say that to understand the categories that we're talking about, that civil divorce, sometimes the church says, yeah, that's going to be needed to protect yourself in these various situations. That would be a good and fine thing, even a necessary thing. But that if you are in a valid Christian marriage, that's still, you have to be faithful to those vows, even with separation, even with that civil divorce. So you can't go and start dating someone new or get remarried or something or any of that if you're in a valid marriage already. And so this is where people, I think, get lost. They play a lot of games. And again, on the impact of children, as a child who was in a situation that experienced some of this, then that took place after his parents' divorce, it makes things so much worse. So to be faithful to what the church teaches and to understand if the church has not granted a valid annulment to say that there was some sort of issue, some impediment that made that marriage initially not valid at all, and then therefore, yes, you were never married, you'd be free to get married. Unless that has happened, you cannot just pretend you're free to enter in to a new marriage. You're not. That's not the way it works, and it's going to do more damage if you do that. So just want to put that word of caution out there. Joey, anything else you want to say on this?
Yeah, no, so good. You earlier mentioned that often divorce is sugar-coated. Like we say things like, well, now you have 2 homes and twice as many Christmas presents to kids. And like you said so well, the truth is that that's such a damaging thing to say, even though it might be well-intentioned. Everyone's trying to make them feel better, to make the kids feel better, trying to maybe help them navigate this really difficult thing that they're going through. But the more helpful thing is just to call divorce what it is. It's a tragedy. It's a trauma. It's a really difficult thing to endure. Even in those cases that we're saying where there might be a necessity for a civil divorce in order to protect the spouse and the children, it's still a tough thing to go through as a kid. And so I think we need to stop sugarcoating divorce, stop saying, well, your family hasn't ended, it's just changed. The truth is that what it felt like for me, Jim, was my family essentially died in a lot of ways. It was very painful. And what I've found with the young people that we work with, that we lead, that we mentor, is that when people say things like that to them, they immediately know that they can't trust that person, because clearly they don't know how painful it is to go through your parents' divorce. And so, we will definitely take our pain elsewhere, hopefully take it elsewhere and hopefully deal with it in a healthy way. And so I think calling it what it is, even though it's hard, is a much better start. But I think at the root of a lot of, we mentioned divorces and annulments and things, is this obviously really big misunderstanding of marriage. And maybe this is more popular in the secular world, but even I've seen it in the Catholic world too, where we assume that the purpose of marriage is happiness. As you and I know, Jim, the purpose of marriage is not happiness. The purpose of marriage is holiness. If you look at the Catholic wedding vows, the traditional wedding vows, nowhere in the wedding vows is happiness promised, which sounds super unromantic. But it's so important, because underneath almost every divorce that I've seen is this belief, consciously or not, we expect our spouse to make us perfectly happy. And when they don't, we tend to think, man, maybe I married the wrong person. Maybe I picked the wrong vocation. We might even be tempted to leave. And so I think what I've seen is your marriage will suffer to the extent that you expect your spouse to make you perfectly happy. Only God could do that. Fulton Sheen wrote a lot about that. But does that mean there's no place for happiness within marriage? No, of course. It's a good thing to experience all the happiness that marriage can bring to make your spouse happy. That's a really good and beautiful thing. But we have to be careful. Marriage is hard work. There's going to be seasons in your marriage. There already have been in mine where it's a grind. It's really difficult. There's challenges. You have to fight through things. You have to, fight for your marriage. It's tempting at times where you might think, maybe I should just leave. This is hard. This is difficult. But we need to remember that marriage is hard work. It doesn't show up on our doorstop in a Prime box. We've been so conditioned in our culture that if we want something, we just click a button, shows up in a couple of days. Not so with marriage. Marriage is more like farming. It takes time to see the fruit of your labor. But we all know this. We all know that the best things in life take hard work. Like, ask any Olympian who won a gold medal how they did it. They're not going to tell you they did it by sitting on their couch and watching Netflix. They did it by showing up every day, putting in the work, especially on the days where they didn't feel like it. If we want great marriages, why should we expect any less? But I really think at the core of so many of the divorces today is this kind of self-centered attitude that, well, marriage is meant to make me happy. If I didn't find that happiness happiness with a spouse, then that means my quote unquote soulmate is somewhere else out there. I'm going to go seek that relationship and be happy no matter what harm that might cause to the spouse that I'm leaving or to my kids.
Yeah, I think that's very well said. And it gets to even perhaps the deeper root of a misunderstanding of what love is, right? What is authentic love? What is real love? To will the good of the other. So you've taken these vows, and now to will the good is to fulfill these vows, even if it's hard, even if it's more unimaginably difficult than you ever thought it would be. Well, by God's grace, let's go, right? It's in the next moment. Do your best to step forward faithfully and do what you promised to do. And that's an act of love. And the thing is that these acts of sacrificial love in union with our Lord, they actually do lead to deep happiness. We're going to be right back. Stay tuned. Welcome back to The Simple Truth. Jim Havens here with Joey Pontarelli, restoredministry.com. Joey, on the questions that you receive from children who have been impacted by their parents' divorce, what would you say is the most common question that you hear?
That's a great question. I would say the questions are often related to relationship struggles. Another area is actually and by that I mean romantic relationships, dating, engagement, marriage. But after that, I would say related to their relationship with their parents. There's a lot of struggle for children of divorce when it comes to their relationship with one or maybe even both parents. There, any number of things that could happen. One of the most common is that mom and dad, or one or the other, potentially both, maybe badmouth the other spouse, when they're not in their presence, and share information that the kids don't need to hear. That's a big, big struggle. Another one is mom and dad might not be on speaking terms, so they pass information back and forth between the child as their messenger. Super damaging. I played that role. It was not pleasant. And probably the most impactful, those are really impactful too, is leaning on your child or having a parent lean on you as their therapist or as you being the emotional confidant. Almost like a spouse of sorts, an emotional spouse. And that's extremely damaging. I've heard psychologists talk about it in pretty harsh terms, not to condemn parents, but to say, like, this is not good for your kid. It's not good for you. It's not good for your relationship. So I would say those are some of the most common. And then just wanting to know, like, how do I heal? How do I not repeat the cycle in my own life? I'm afraid of that. I've seen maybe other families where divorce ran in the family. I have a close friend of mine who, she actually came on my podcast. My wife and I are friends with her and her husband. She said that she's like, Joey, on the one side of my family, I can only think of one couple that didn't get divorced. One couple. And so I think there's a lot of fear. Like, I don't want to repeat this. I want to give my kids better. And thankfully that is happening in large part. But on the other end of the spectrum, we do have people who are just running from love and marriage. We see this struggle a lot. There's just a lot of fear. Like I experienced, they don't want to repeat that cycle. And so they think, well, I'm better off on my own. I'm better off just not going down this path of love and marriage and opening myself up to that possible hurt. So there's so many different struggles that they face. I didn't even touch on emotional problems if they're dealing with a lot of anxiety, depression, things like that. We obviously are not therapists, so we refer that out to trained therapists. But yeah, there's any number of struggles that they bring to us.
Yeah, your book is called It's Not Your Fault. What are some things that children impacted by their parents' divorce, what are some things that they blame themselves for?
Yeah. Oh gosh, this is a big one. So I would say there was a girl who came up to me after a talk I gave to a bunch of college students. So she was a college-age girl. She said, Joey, my dad still blames me for the divorce that happened 10 years prior. Now, to be fair, I've never heard of another parent who explicitly, blame their child like that to their face. I've heard, stories where maybe they said it behind their back or alluded to it, but I don't think most parents are saying that or even believing that. But I think kids can certainly feel the responsibility. They can feel like, man, if I wasn't around, and that's what that dad was implying. Like, if you kids weren't around, we would have never gotten divorced. And so that's certainly a big struggle, feeling like your parents' divorce is your fault, blaming yourself for your parents' divorce, blaming yourself for the struggles that they had in their marriage. Or if maybe you know better than that, maybe you're like, no, I don't struggle with that. You might still feel some level of responsibility, like, well, I did, maybe I was misbehaving at that stage in my life. If I had my act together, maybe they wouldn't have gotten divorced, or maybe I could have done something to help them, especially if you're a little bit on the older side. Maybe you're thinking like, maybe I should have said this or did that, or I could have intervened, or I could have made everything right. And so that's tempting to think too. But to anyone, listening who maybe struggled there, I would just say that, there's nothing that you did to cause it. There's nothing that you, can do to fix it. You couldn't have prevented it. It's really your parents' job to fix their marriage, not yours. It's not your place. And what I've seen too is typically the problems that led to the divorce were probably there long before you were. They didn't originate with you. Maybe they got worse because of the stress of life, but they probably didn't start with you. And and so there's a lot there certainly, but I think that at times when parents say it or other people say things like that, it can make kids feel like it's their fault when it's really not.
Mm-hmm. Joey Pontarelli is with us, restoredministry.com. If you have a question or comment you want to get in, 1-877-511-5483. That's 1-877-511-5483. Joey, what do you say to somebody who thinks, I turned out fine, my parents' divorce didn't affect me at all? What would you say to them?
One, awesome. That's great. Two, you're kind of a statistical anomaly, to be honest with you. If you actually read the research, there's a lot of struggle that comes along with this. Three, I would say define fine. What do you mean by fine? Do you mean that your life is going really well, or do you mean that you're functional, even though you're struggling with an addiction, or, you have a hard time holding down a relationship, or you can't trust people? Like there's often these problems that we carry with us. We're all guilty of this. We carry with us that we assume are normal, when in reality, if we hold them up against, a blueprint of the human person that's truly flourishing, we would say, oh yeah, no, that's not normal. And, maybe that is related to your parents' divorce. And so to anyone in that situation, I would say, just get curious. I'm not saying that, you have to walk around saying like, oh, my parents' divorce was the worst thing, I'm doomed now. Of course not. That's not what I'm saying. But there's something about one of the there's different stages of healing. And one of the things I found helpful that kind of originated from JP2, and I've learned from Dr. Greg Bottaro, is healing starts often at the level of self-knowledge. Because so often, Jim, I'm sure you can relate to this. I know I can. We don't really understand why we think, feel, and act the way that we do. And so where healing often starts is on the level of self-knowledge, of digging into our story, of understanding what happened to us, the different people that played a role in that. There's a therapist that I've listened to who has an awesome podcast, Adam Young. It's called The Place We Find Ourselves. He's an evangelical guy, but really, really good stuff. He says when it comes to experiencing healing, naming how you've been harmed is about 70% of the battle, which sounds kind of simplistic, but it's really important. We need to dig into our stories. And neurobiologists, according to Adam Young, neurobiologists have found that the act of just reflecting on your story in a constructive way actually heals you and makes your brain healthier. So one measure of brain health is neural connectivity. Think of your brain as a web of neurons. The more connections between those webs, the healthier your brain. Reflecting on your story in that active way that I said actually increases neural connectivity, thereby making your brain healthier, making you healthier. So we have to go back. We have to, as Father Mike Schmidt says, in order to be restored, you have to visit the place of your ruin. We have to do that hard work, ideally with a therapist or with a mentor. It's hard to do that alone, but we have to do that. But from self-knowledge, we go into self-awareness, where we can take the awareness of our past, of our struggles, of our weaknesses, our vices, into everyday situations, into our relationships especially. And then after self-awareness, we enter into self-mastery or self-possession, where now we're able to not let maybe our past, our trauma, our subconscious dictate the way that we think, act, and feel. We're able to have more mastery to develop virtue in those relationships and those everyday interactions. And then from there, self-mastery leads to self-gift. Because as you said before, we're made for love. We're made by love. We are made to live a life of love. We're made to will the good of other people. And so often our brokenness, our untreated brokenness, our unhealed trauma can actually be a barrier. It can prevent us from loving people well. And so if we do find healing and we grow in virtue, then we're able to actually love better. Our capacity to love increases. And that's just such a good and beautiful goal. So so that's been helpful for me, but those are a few things that I would say. But was there anything else on that question?
No, I think you laid it out well. And I guess, have you any stories or any common patterns or anything that you've noticed when people do finally open up about their pain? Maybe they haven't been aware, and then they become aware, and they've got somebody who's willing to listen. They're finally able to talk about it. Have you seen any good fruits? Anything you can share with us to help us understand this a little bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say it's really common, kind of like going back to the research we talked about from UC Berkeley, for people to become more aware of how impactful their parents' divorce was on them later in life, like in their 20s, 30s, maybe even 40s. Often they don't realize how much it impacted them because they were walking around, maybe because people told them this, or maybe because they themselves just believe that, oh, it's not a big deal. That's fine. It's not a big deal. I'm fine. I'll be fine. And then years later, they, maybe break down. There's a woman who came on my podcast who, by many measures, she was just this really successful, driven woman. She had lived, a good life, but in her late 20s, she was a nurse. She went on a medical mission to somewhere in Central South America. And on that mission, even though, again, she had told herself for years, my parents' divorce didn't affect me, I'm good. She just had this emotional breakdown, and it was really intense. And so she had to leave the mission, come home, and she just was kind of hit in the face with this, like, what is going on with me? And as she got, the right help, went to therapy, she just uncovered that, man, there's so much pain that was kind of dormant, hidden underneath the surface that I just wasn't giving attention to, that maybe I didn't even realize was there. And so there is this kind of phase of, some people talk about it as thawing out, where you just come to this greater awareness. Or what we see a lot of, Jim, is when people enter into relationships and they feel, like I had mentioned in my story, kind of lost. Like I don't really know what it looks like or what it takes to build a healthy relationship or a good marriage, a healthy, strong marriage, because they didn't see that growing up. Because as the church teaches, as John Paul II said, that the family is meant to be the school of love. And so that's the training you got in love. That's, the degree you got in love. And if maybe it was good, if you came from a really beautiful family, if you came from a family where mom and dad loved each other, they modeled that well, you got a great education in relationships and love. But if you didn't, then that's going to present a problem. And it doesn't mean that you're doomed. You can learn those things from other sources. Thankfully, there can be father figures, mother figures who enter your life and, teach you that, but it's going to be harder. I will say that, because more than anyone else, our parents teach us what it's like to love. And so those are some kind of common areas or moments in life where people kind of struggle. They wake up and they see, man, yeah, maybe that did affect me more than I thought. But the other thing I would mention too, just to kind of piggyback on this last question, was there are cases. There was a study they did in Turkey where they looked at high school students who came from divorced families, and they found that, as you'd expect, the students, from divorced families, they were more likely to struggle with anxiety, depression, and loneliness. But if they had a good relationship with one or both parents, then those chances were decreased. They were significantly less likely to struggle with anxiety, depression, and loneliness. And so if someone's walking through life saying like, no, I'm doing pretty well, there's a good chance that some of those negative effects were mitigated, were prevented, because one or both of their parents really stepped up and loved them well. And so it's not an automatic like condemnation or death, certificate if your parents get divorced. But when you look at the data, it's just like, most likely this is what's going to happen. Most people have experienced this, but there certainly are some outliers. But I would say those are some of the main things. And the two things that I think really move people toward kind of digging into this deeper is, one, hearing stories of people like them who've struggled in ways that they've struggled with, and they trace that back to their parents' divorce or the dysfunction at home. That's one situation. And two, hearing studies, really, validated research that says, yeah, we looked at, these 3,000 children in France from the age of 11 to 13, and we found that they had lower self-esteem than, children from intact families. Like, that's super interesting. I've always struggled with confidence. I didn't really understand that it was, related to my parents not being together. And so I think that can help. And so that's a lot of like the content that we put out. We try to mentor through our content. And part of that is just making people aware of the problem. So we focus a lot on stories, and we talk about studies.
Phenomenal. You can find it all at Joey's website, restoredministry.com. We're going to get into some of what is mentioned on the homepage of that website when we get back, which states you're not doomed to repeat your family's dysfunction. To avoid this cycle, you need to heal and grow But if you don't, there are real dangers. Studies show that children of divorce are more likely to struggle in romantic relationships, get divorced, struggle in relationships with their parents. It gives the whole list there, but it says it doesn't have to be your story. If you are a teen or a young adult from a broken family, you're in the right place. So many wonderful resources there. His podcast, you can find it there. So much on the website, restoredministry.com. You need to know that resource. There are surely people in your life that can benefit from it. Know it, share it, restoredministry.com. We're going to be right back with Joey. Stay tuned. You know, there's the sort of the natural healing, I guess, the natural wisdom based on reason that people have figured out, and there's some good ways to heal with respect to that. And then there's also, you can put the layer of the Catholic faith into this, which is obviously a very powerful resource for healing. Our Lord Jesus, the divine physician himself. And so how does this fit together? What do you recommend for people? Should they understand that both aspects are needed? Certainly the aspect of going to Christ to me seems paramount. And if we know there he is in the Holy Eucharist and living the Catholic faith, and we get all of that, then, you know, so much of just being faithful, a faithful Catholic is going to bring you healing along the way. But there still may be a need for some other resources as well. What would you say about it?
Yeah, no, it's a great point. And I do think healing works that way. There's like the human level of healing and the spiritual level of healing. The greatest hack you'll ever experience, the greatest healing hack is grace, is God's grace, which is God's life within us. And one of the effects of grace is that it helps us to do good and avoid evil. And so many of the struggles, you know, involve maybe falling into bad habits, the other things when it comes to, you know, suffering from your parents' divorce. And so on the human level, I kind of had mentioned in the last segment, or one of the last segments, some different things about like reflecting on your story. As simplistic as it sounds, there's actually neurobiologists have found that it actually can make your brain healthier. But that's on the human side. There's also writing exercises that we talk about that can be really helpful. This is not the same as like kind of mindlessly journaling, but there's a researcher at University of Texas at Austin who's been studying this for basically over 40 years and has found that people who do these specific writing exercises are less depressed, they're less anxious, they're happier, they're healthier, they have better memory, more success at work, all these awesome benefits. And that's just because they're, you know, not just keeping things held inside their chest and their head and their heart, they're getting them out. That's basically the core of it. So that's Professor James Penbaker is his name. Anyway, so that's like the human side of it, which I think is helpful. And often a lot of the young people that I'm working with, there's a lot of anger toward God. That's not often what we lead with. We ultimately want to lead them into a relationship with God because that's where they're going to experience the most healing. Because as I see it and what I've experienced in my life, the human side, the human level of healing is eventually going to hit a ceiling. You're only going to be able to go so far. In fact, a lot of therapists who don't have like a Catholic understanding of the human person, or at least a very good Christian understanding of the human person, might not be able to help you the way that a competent Catholic therapist can, because they understand, you know, what we're made for. They understand kind of the blueprint of the human person, what that looks like when we're flourishing. And so I think, you know, if you can find a competent therapist, we've partnered with Catholic Psych. Dr. Greg Bottaro is a psychologist who's created this really cutting edge model of therapy. And I shouldn't say therapy, it's mentorship. It's kind of breaking away from the therapy model where they walk daily with people who need mentorship, who need help. And so they have different packages, different levels of mentorship. They really don't turn anyone away. So if you go to their website, catholicpsych.com/apply, you can find that. We even have a code if you put in, I think it's Restored 24, you get like 10% off or something like that, Restored 24. So anyway, that's a good resource when it comes to healing. But on the spiritual side, I think so often there's a temptation, especially for those of us who are devout Catholics, to not bring to God the messiness within us. We kind of assume that God wants us to show up in our Sunday best with our suit on, with a tie on, very presentable, where we don't show him the flaws. But what I've seen is we need to bring all of it to him. He sees it anyway. And so we need to bring him the anger. We need to bring him maybe the disappointment. We need to bring him the hurt. Because I remember as a young person, I was just really struggling with this idea, like, God, why did you let this happen? Why did you let my family fall apart? And maybe more importantly, like, where were you through all of this? And I did not get an answer quickly, Jim. It took time, a lot of spiritual direction, a lot of adoration, a lot of prayer. But in time, I've become so convinced that he wasn't just, kind of this distant, aloof God. He was right there in the midst of it for me, with me. He was right there, with that Joey who had just found out about his parents getting divorced. And, as I look back through my life, I realized, like, even though I, maybe couldn't see him, I couldn't sense him, he was there and doing what he could while respecting human freedom. And so one of the things that's been so helpful for me is that, sometimes God's only response to our pain is his presence. Father Mike Schmidt said that sometimes God's only response to our pain is his presence. And he cares deeply. Like we see that in scripture, right? When his friend Lazarus dies, it's really kind of an odd scene, where he shows up and he knows he's going to raise his friend, this guy from the dead. And yet he weeps. Kind of odd. If it was me, I'd be like, hey guys, it's cool. Stop crying. Everything's going to be okay. I'm going to raise him from the dead. Everything will be great. But he weeps. And I think he did that because he wanted to show us that human suffering moves the heart of God. And so we learned through that he's not indifferent. He's not this a God who's sitting on the sidelines, as I felt as a young person, but he's right there in the midst of it with us, even if we can't see him or feel him. He's certainly there. And yeah, suffering's a mystery. It's not always clear like why it happens. That's something I still wrestle with to this day. But I trust that he's smarter than me. I trust that he knows, what he's about, as St. John Newman said so beautifully. And so those are a few things I think that we need to start where we need to start. There's some human level things. We can go to therapy. We can get mentorship. That's been incredibly helpful for me. I've had some great therapists who really, really helped me, overcome, whether it was bad habits or just emotional problems that I was struggling with, like feeling, kind of sad and depressed or anxious. I was able to, talk through some things and maybe do some exercises and figure out if, it was something physiological or more, psychological trauma based from my past. So all that stuff can be really good, but really digging into the sacramental life of the church. Like I said, grace is the greatest thing that you can do in order to heal, the greatest thing you can receive, the greatest hack of healing. And so confession, of course, the Eucharist, daily Mass if you can, adoration, of course, all those things that are incredibly powerful. Spiritual direction, I'd recommend too. The spiritual director's role is not to be a therapist, but to really just help you interpret God's voice in your life and interpret where you feel led by God. And so those are a few things. And the final thing I would say, a couple of things is, so I kind of mentioned all those things under the umbrella of coaching. So whether it's therapy or mentorship or spiritual direction, that's kind of like under the coaching umbrella, we could say. The other C's that we preach about is good content. So it's incredibly good content, good information. Educating yourself can be incredibly transformative. And so I would say, consuming content around healing, trauma, like learning more about how that affects you and how to heal from it is incredibly helpful. That's one of the things we're trying to do with our podcast. Our whole ministry really is put out content that's really helpful, that informs people, makes them aware about, brokenness, trauma, but also how to heal from it. Dr. Bob Schutz has a lot of great stuff out there. I already mentioned Catholic Psych. There's some other, great apostolates too, doing good work on when it comes to healing. So consuming good content. And then finally, I would say community, right? Walking with people who, are kind of, not necessarily mentors who are above you, but friends who are beside you. And I know, Jim, you're so big on helping men become, the masculine men that we're called to be. And what I've seen in my own life is like, we need good men around us who can challenge us, who can sharpen us into being the best men we can be. And so it's especially helpful, whether it's, men and women in a group, to have a group of people who can relate with you, who've gone through their parents' divorce, who come from a lot of dysfunction and can say, yeah, me too. I totally get that struggle. Here's what worked for me. Here's what was helpful for me. You can feel less alone and maybe even get some ideas and resources for how to navigate those difficult waters. So the content, coaching, community, those are kind of the 3 C's that we preach when it comes to healing and navigating your parents' divorce.
Yes, Joey Pontarelli, restoredministry.com. The book, It's Not Your Fault. You can find it there as well, restoredministry.com. Joey, thank you so much for being on with us. Thank you for all your great work.
My pleasure. Great to be with you. And we're here to serve and help anyone who has gone through their parents' divorce or wants to help someone who has.
Awesome. Yeah, Joey laid out so much that is so good for us. And there's our Lord. We got to go to our Lord, and he's going to help us along the way. So just keep moving forward. God bless you all.